So this is a session on power blocks, and we thought we would start then with the United States as the still leading power in the world, but increasingly put under pressure from rivals such as China and Russia. Its alliances are a main asset on the global arena, and NATO is the most important alliance of them all. So during 2022, the US presented both a national security strategy and a national defense strategy, while NATO adopted a new strategic concept. So I will take a look at both of those documents and try to answer a few questions. How do these strategic documents compare in terms of assessing rivals and adversaries? What do they tell us about how the US and NATO are adapting to a more dangerous and competitive world? And also, in the end, is the transatlantic community holding together or drifting apart? Do these documents tell us or give us any kind of guidance in regard to this? But I will start in trying to frame these documents into the international system and how it's changing. From what we have heard from previous panels, also discussing the Cold War. But after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, there was this transition from bipolarity to a system dominated by the United States, a unipolar system with the United States as the only remaining superpower, and basically dominating the international system for quite some time ahead. We had Russian President Vladimir Putin. He complained about American dominance in the world in his famous Munich security speech in 2007. But he also admitted in that speech that after the fall of the Berlin Wall, even the Russians preferred the American way, that is, democracy, freedom, and openness. This lasted for quite some time, even though it was disputed. You remember it was called the unipolar moment or the unipolar illusion. But for the past, since up until 2014, most scholars seem to agree, and I adhere to that as well, that the world was unipolar when we had the first Russian invasion, the illegal annexation of Crimea, and the Russian start of the war in Donbass. However, China and Russia had started at that time to act as rivals in global affairs, but it was not really acknowledged by the United States at that time. By 2022, almost a decade later, at the releases of its strategic documents, it's quite clear that great power competition has been acknowledged as a main characteristic of the international system, affecting the way that America has to relate to its allies, and including then, of course, not least NATO. So for the Biden administration, a core feature of its foreign policy is to work closer with allies. As the United States acknowledges its decreasing power relative to other rising global actors, Washington understands it cannot really dominate the conditions of world politics anymore alone. In the decade that will set the terms of geopolitical competition between major powers, as it is described, the US seeks to invest in its allies while setting high expectations on them in competing against adversaries in the contest for the future of the world. And that future is a future between democracies or autocracies. So that is how the picture is made. And the US then, interestingly enough, I think, envisions and recognizes that the unipolar era is over. They want a bipolar world. And this is still a world where the US can lead, and where the US is not one of several poles in a multipolar system. That is not what the US wants, and the coming decade will really set set the terms on whether that is achievable or not for the US. And the possible nightmare is, of course, a new unipolar world by 2050 dominated by China. But that is not really explicit, but it's underlying in some of the analysis as well. And what is important then for allies to kind of fetch is this expectations from the US side to still accept US leadership and to kind of align in this mixture of Francis Fukuyama kind of proposition that democracy is still the best solution, and if once people have been experiencing, this is what they will choose. And a more realist stance, Mersheimer, Waltz, and others that kind of say that rival that's inevitable, and this is what you have to take. You have to pick the fight and take it. What we heard also Mrs. Thatcher, the way she envisioned the world. So this is what we have now, and what does that mean when the US kind of meets NATO? Well, from the American point of view, NATO is the concrete expression of its obligation to kind of have an indivisible security community between America and Europe. And NATO is the central instrument in that to pursue a US-led international order based on these universal values and free trade, aiming to promote peace and security. And on the more practical level, NATO is an instrument to deal efficiently with European affairs. And that's always shadowed by the question from the American side that, Henry Kissinger posted in the 1970s, but it's still that question, who do you call when you want to call Europe? So NATO is important from the American side in that perspective still. But there is a major shift for NATO or European allies to also take note in here when we scrutinize the strategic documents of the United States, and that is that the American agenda with European allies, it's transatlantic in its foundation, but it's global in its ambition. So this is not a piece of the pie that just affects Europe. What the American wants to build is something much bigger together with the Europeans at this stage. And that's quite a big shift if you compare to 2014, 2018 strategic documents, when Europe was more called upon assisting the United States as the leader of the world. Now the US wants to build with the Europeans alongside them. So they are inviting Europeans along, not only in defense, but in trade, technology, investments, and so on. And this is what the European allies also have to respond to. Now, if we look at the threats and see what assessment the United States does, and when you look at NATO, how much are there divergences or are they identical? We can see that both the US and NATO sees China, Russia, and terrorism as the core security threats, but they prioritize them differently, and that's not completely surprising, since the US is a global actor and NATO is by its formation a regional security organization. But still, it is interesting to note that the US clearly states that the US is prioritizing the China challenge in the Indo-Pacific and then the Russia challenge in Europe. So that's a clear hierarchy in that sense, while NATO, on the other side, is very clear in its concept that Russia is the most significant and direct threat to Allied security. So here we have a differentiation in how you see this. It shouldn't be exaggerated in the short term, but because there is alignment on that Russia is an immediate threat, and there is alignment on how this affects the need to deal with Ukraine war, because Russia is also threatening the international order. But it's not threatening the international order in the same way as China does, because China, from the American perspective, is the only power with the aggregated capacity, militarily, socially, economically, technically, to actually completely shift the international system to China's advantage and US disadvantage. Russia, on the other hand, is seen as a waning power. And that's a huge difference when it comes to the mindset of the Americans. China can reshape the international system. Russia can disturb it, but not really reshape it, looking ahead into the future. China, I think our next speaker, Benedetta, you will touch upon this much more in detail, but China came rather recently on the NATO agenda, and you can see that both US and China and NATO are now seeing China as this multi-domain challenge. It's a win, you can say, for the US that in the strategic concept, China is kind of described this way, but I will come back to in the end that there are still discrepancies on this. But you can take note that China is included in the strategic concept for the first time, and that is something that the US has been pushing for. I want to mention also the question of nuclear deterrence, because that's really important also when it comes to understanding how the US views China. So this is also an area where we have a big shift from the US perspective, and the fact that China is quickly building up its nuclear arsenal, 250 missile silos, could have up to 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030. That means for the United States that for the first time since nuclear weapons emerged on the global scene, they will have to have strategic deterrence in two directions. And that's a huge challenge. That will have to shift the whole nuclear posture of the United States, probably will lead to an increase in nuclear warheads, and it will affect NATO and European allies as well when it comes to extended deterrence, and possibly also expectations on what we can provide when it comes to nuclear sharing. And then I just want to briefly touch upon terrorism as well, because it's interesting, also very interesting to note, I think, that the way that the US is now looking at terrorism, its war on terror, this whole era symbolized by the withdrawal from Afghanistan, that is over for the United States. So terrorism, counterterrorism is put lower when it comes to priority. We can see it on how the US is withdrawing from the Middle East, opening up for all kinds of new dynamics in the Middle East. And also its increasing focus on domestic terrorism. It's the first time that term appears in a national security strategy document in modern times. Has, of course, to do with what happened in Capitolium on January 6th, and the consequences that has for how the US thinks about terrorism. That is not reflected in NATO or the strategic document, and quite on the contrary, for some NATO allies in Europe, terrorism is still a very high on the agenda. Sweden has to deal with that when it comes to its dialogue with Turkey now on becoming a member. That is at the core of the Turkish mindset. And you have other allies as well, France and others, that's still important for them to an extent that it's not. It will not be the US perhaps driving that, but European allies driving that within NATO agenda. And then, if we just round up here on how this will play out within the transatlantic community. I think you should note that President Macron, after his China visit, one of his conclusions was that Europe faced the threat of becoming a vassal, he called it, between the United States and China, while it could be a third pole. We had Chancellor Scholz in May speaking in European Parliament saying that the world is multipolar and has been for a long time. And the German Zeitenwende clearly refers to Russia, but not to China. So we have here China and the American way of looking at China as, you know, a rival and adversary is not reflected on the European scene at all. There is public support on viewing Russia that way in Europe, 62% according to the latest DSFR poll, but not China. It's still mostly a partner, possibly a rival, a competitor, but there is no agreement here. So I would conclude in sum, I think this is the main message here, that China is the long-term strategic challenge, yes. In the US, bipartisan support for this assessment, and it's potentially the biggest divide across the Atlantic, and possible alignment between the US and Europe on China will have a big influence on shaping also the international system ahead. So thank you very much.
Anna, will the Finnish membership in NATO and the possible Swedish change NATO's strategy?
I think it will solidify NATO's strategy because it will, I think the most important contribution there will be that NATO becomes stronger, and it will indirectly also make the EU stronger because we are members of the EU. So in a way, it will help solidify the West in this future competition.
And it's of importance to the United States as well.
It is definitely, because you get one solution, and that's what the US is striving for when it comes to Europe.